You ask anyone on the internet what the worst Sonic game is, and it's very likely that Shadow the Hedgehog is going to come up. Shadow was introduced to the Sonic series in Sonic Adventure 2 as a darker and more serious rival to Sonic, and it was meant to be his only appearance, with him dying at the end of the game. But he was so popular that Sega had no choice but to keep bringing him back. He appeared in many spin-off games, and he was brought back as Team Dark's speed character in Sonic Heroes. And eventually, in 2005, his popularity culminated when he got his very own game, Shadow the Hedgehog, known by many people today as Shadow 05. It was meant to be a darker and edgier take on the Sonic series. Not only is it considerably more violent with it featuring realistic firearms, but the plot involves an all-out war between humans and demonic aliens, characters occasionally say mild curse words, and it's less afraid to discuss darker subjects like death. I was one of the millions of people that played this game as a child, and I absolutely loved it. It was a game that I went back to a lot during my teenage years, and now, as an adult, I still love it, but this is not an opinion shared by many people. I was completely unaware of just how detested this game was until I started using the internet more as a teenager. The gaming media was not kind to this game when it came out. GameSpot gave it a 4.8 out of 10, citing poor controls and camera, while IGN only gave it a single decimal point higher, citing bad level design and the uselessness of guns. And both the PS2 and Xbox versions sit at red Metacritic scores, with the GameCube version just barely being in the yellow. Now, with many games, there's always a bit of a disconnect between players and quote-unquote professional reviewers working at big outlets, especially with a controversial series like Sonic. But this was an instance where critics and the vocal player base were mostly in agreement. In fact, the vocal fan base actually made the critics seem generous in comparison. And when big gaming YouTubers started doing videos on this game in the coming years, its reputation only got worse. When Some Call Me Johnny was doing his Sonic Marathon back in 2012, he was not kind to this game, stating very angrily that it was horrible, and it sounded like he hated this game even more than he did 06. In Super Bunny Hop's video looking at the first levels in the Sonic series, he said that Shadow the Hedgehog was, quote, rock bottom for the series. And in Gilly the Kid's video, where he played through some of the most notorious contenders for the worst game ever made, this was one of them. Even Jay's reviews, who's normally pretty kind to Sonic games of this era, including 06, was still pretty harsh on this game. I don't really agree with these videos. I think a lot of the criticism this game gets is way too harsh, and popular videos like these have given this game an undeserved negative reputation. In fact, Shadow the Hedgehog is not only a game that I think is good, it's actually probably my favorite Sonic game. At least it was until Shadow Generations came out. I think this is a good game. I'm not going to deny that this game has glaring flaws, but I do think many of its flaws are overblown, and I think it has a lot of positive qualities that it doesn't get enough recognition for. And just to be clear here, I'm not knocking any of these YouTubers or their videos. In fact, I like all of these guys and their videos, even if I don't always agree with them. But as I said, this has led to this game becoming what I think is overhated. And you could say that I'm only defending this game because I grew up with it and I'm blinded by nostalgia, which I won't say I have no nostalgia bias towards it, but I like to think that I can look at something pretty objectively regardless of my past experiences with it. There are plenty of things I grew up with that I now look back on as being not all that good. And there are also plenty of games that I like that I would still consider bad games, but Shadow the Hedgehog is not one of them. In this video, I'm going to be looking at this game and explaining why I think this is the case, as someone who has owned and been a fan of this game for the almost 20 years that it's been out, and has poured hundreds of hours into it over those years. And I think it's only fitting that I start with this game's supposed biggest fundamental flaw, the subject matter. Most people seem to be appalled by the fact that Sega would attempt to do a darker themed Sonic game at all, because Sonic is supposed to be cartoony and lighthearted, he's supposed to be happy, he's supposed to be bright and colorful. That's probably what you're thinking right now if you were introduced to Sonic through any of his games in the early 2010s up until recently, or if you've watched any big YouTubers cover this game and other Sonic games from this era. But that's not entirely true. Sonic was introduced in the early 90s to be a mascot for Sega and a competitor to Mario, and one of the things that made him stand out was his attitude and edginess. Maybe not to the same extent as Shadow the Hedgehog, but these games still dealt with a lot of uncomfortable themes. I mean, the whole plot of the classic Sonic games is how Eggman is kidnapping animals and forcing them to pilot his robots, while expanding his empire and poisoning the local environment. And this is only concerning the games. The cartoons and comics were going even further. In Adventure 1, Eggman gets driven so mad after being defeated that he tries to nuke an entire city with a missile that probably would have killed millions of people, including himself given how close he was to the city. And in Adventure 2, his grandfather tries to annihilate the human race as revenge for killing his granddaughter. Believe it or not, an even darker, more mature-themed Sonic game was something that fans had been wanting long before this game's release. That probably sounds preposterous given how that's one of this game's biggest points of contention, but in order to truly get you to understand, I have to take you back to the 2000s. Today, video games are universally accepted as a medium of entertainment that can be enjoyed by anyone, regardless of age or sex. But in the 70s and 80s, when video games were first being introduced, they were largely seen as glorified electronic toys for children. In the 90s, games like Mortal Kombat and Doom came along and showed us that video games can be mature and violent and made for adults. But these games came under a lot of controversy for this reason, and I don't even think it would be unreasonable to say that the majority of people that played these games back in the day were still kids. Then comes the turn of the millennium. Video games are exploding in popularity to an unprecedented degree that nobody in the 70s or 80s would have ever predicted, and are making record-breaking profits. In fact, Halo 2 in 2004 was the biggest entertainment launch in history, not just in video games, but across all mediums, books, movies, everything. But even with that, they still weren't quite accepted the same way they are today. At best, video games were seen as a counterculture for nerds and dorks, and at worst, a conspiracy to brainwash children into becoming deranged, murderous psychopaths. I would know. I couldn't go a week without having to listen to my mom rant about how Kirby Air Ride was going to turn me into a mass shooter. It was sort of a transitional period between something being new and niche and something being widely accepted as normal. Because of this, publishers, developers, and gamers were desperately trying to push the medium into being more accepted and prove to everyone that video games can be just as impactful as any book or movie. Not only that, but games with lots of mature content were selling extremely well. I already mentioned that Halo 2, an M-rated game, was the biggest entertainment launch of all time up until that point. But that same year, GTA San Andreas was the best-selling game, selling almost 7 million copies, and the best-selling game of 2002 was Vice City, coming about 1 million short. This created a belief that in order to be considered any good, games had to be dark and violent and continue to push the boundaries of what video games could get away with, and this belief affected every aspect of the medium. That didn't necessarily mean that all games had to be aimed exclusively at adults and have M ratings, but competing games in every genre were trying to one-up each other by showing off how dark and edgy they were. And successors to these games didn't just have to improve the gameplay and graphics, they also had to be edgier than the last game. And games that did this at the time were actually praised for doing so, while games that did the opposite were lambasted for it. In fact, this was one of the criticisms of Sonic Heroes. Taking all that into consideration, what reason was there not to go in this direction with Sonic? This is how Shadow the Hedgehog was conceived. It was a byproduct of fans asking for something darker and more mature during a time when there was a push for games to be just that. But if you can believe it, the Shadow the Hedgehog we got was actually a dumbed-down version of what was originally planned. Originally, Sega was aiming for a T rating with Shadow the Hedgehog. In pre-release material, you could see that gun soldiers and black aliens bleed red blood when attacked. In some of the English dialogue, characters say the word hell, and Maria's death is shown on screen. However, in 2005, the ESRB introduced the E10 rating so that they wouldn't have to give games meant for older children T ratings for dumb reasons. Even though they still did, but this was the reason that Sega decided to censor Shadow the Hedgehog before release. They decided to backpedal so that the game would get an E10 rating instead. In the final game, gun soldiers no longer bleed, aliens now bleed green blood, characters don't say hell out of its proper context anymore, and the screen cuts out the moment Maria gets shot. It makes me wonder what this game's reception would have been like if Sega stuck to their guns and kept the T rating. Although, nowadays the E10 rating is basically what the E rating was 20 years ago, and I'm sure had this game released today, it would have gotten a T rating anyway. Whatever the case, Sega seemed to have a lot of confidence in this direction and ran an aggressive marketing campaign before this game's release. And with a longer development cycle this time, they put a lot of effort into this game's development. For one thing, Shadow the Hedgehog is a very content-rich game, featuring a total of 23 levels. That's more than Heroes and almost as much as Adventure 1 and 2 across all of their storylines. It is a bit disappointing that there are no Chow Gardens, but those weren't in Heroes either, so I guess I can't complain. Now, the only character you can play as is Shadow, but that means all of the stages are speed stages, which is a good thing, right? I thought everyone unanimously agreed that these were the best parts of the adventure games. But content doesn't really matter if the gameplay still sucks, but it doesn't? At least, I don't think it does. I actually think Shadow the Hedgehog is one of the most fun games in the series for all the right reasons. The gameplay expands upon the fast-paced platforming gameplay that began with Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast, and just by looking at Shadow the Hedgehog, it's clear that it's built right on top of Sonic Heroes. It reuses a lot of assets from Sonic Heroes, including Shadow's model, and it controls similarly as well. Which, speaking of, the most common complaint I hear is that the controls are slippery, like the game controls as if you're skating. I mean, that's kind of what you're doing, but this is a complaint that I simply just don't agree with. First of all, as I said, this game runs on the same engine as Sonic Heroes and it controls similarly, which I don't hear nearly as many complaints about. I think Shadow controls just fine. Great, in fact. Much better than Heroes, that's for sure, and not slippery at all. I think the reason people say this is because of how fast you go. Shadow the Hedgehog has the same momentum-based speed that the other games do, but when you move with the joystick, Shadow reaches his max speed almost immediately. However, when you stop moving, Shadow comes to a complete stop almost immediately too. The max speed is great for getting you through linear pathways without obstacles, but the fast braking is great for moving through stages in short, speedy bursts. If you're doing a hunting mission or just going through an area with a lot of obstacles and enemies, you can slow down, take care of them, and speed through until you need to do this again. Not only that, but not all of Shadow's momentum carries into his jumping, so if you want an easy way to slow down without coming to a complete stop, jumping is a good way to do this, especially if there are enemies nearby to homing attack. It also makes it easier to transition from running to platforming when going at high speeds too, and if that still isn't enough, Shadow will always stop himself the first time if he's about to run off a cliff. I also think people call the controls slippery because when Shadow is going at his top speed, he still turns at the same speed as when he's going slower, and you do have to tug pretty hard on the joystick to make sharper turns, but this is really only an issue when going at your absolute fastest, and it's not even that hard to get used to it. And even then, most of the sections that encourage you to go your fastest have barriers that prevent you from getting sent flying off the cliff. Platforming sections usually have multiple ways to get around them. Usually it's at least two of either homing attacking enemies, lightspeed dashing, wall jumping, or simply hopping across the platforms. But it also allows you to exploit its physics to find shortcuts just like Adventure 1 and 2 did. And the levels are made to accommodate whatever playstyle you may favor or whichever mission you're doing. Which brings me to another major aspect of Shadow, the different missions and branching story. Which stage the game sends you to depends on which mission you do. Every stage in Shadow the Hedgehog has usually 3 but sometimes 2 different missions: Dark, Hero, and Normal. Dark missions have you doing favors for whatever evil faction is present at each stage, usually Black Doom and the Black Aliens, but sometimes Eggman. While Hero missions are favors for either the human army, your companion character, and in one case, also Eggman. Then there are the normal missions that are always you just ignoring both sides and trying to make it to the end goal. I actually think the mission variety here is a nice touch, giving more variety to the gameplay of an already extremely content-packed game, but also as a way to add some extra flavor to an already well-established gameplay style, and expanding on the alternate missions of Team Chaotix's gameplay from Sonic Heroes. I think the missions are a lot of fun to do. However, I do agree that the overall design of some of the missions could have been better. The most common type of mission you see in this game is killing all enemies of the opposite alignment, and that usually means all of them. Only in some missions are you given any amount of mercy, and even then it's not a lot. This wouldn't be such a big deal if there was an easier way to know where enemies are, with like a radar or something, but there isn't, and there's nothing more frustrating than making it to the end of the stage only to realize that you missed one, forcing you to run back through the stage a second time or more just to find that last enemy that you missed. The game does try to mitigate this somewhat by allowing you to teleport between checkpoints, but there's no way to know which checkpoint the enemies are closest to, so that's not really helpful. However, I do think this actually isn't as bad as people say, because the more you play, the better you learn how this game places enemies, and you know where to look to ensure that you don't miss any. The levels are also largely linear like the rest of the adventure-style games, so it's not like you have to do too much exploring. However, some levels also have forks in the road that you need to take depending on which mission you're doing, and your companion characters will tell you which way to go in these situations, so most of the time, it's really not that bad. Notice how I said most of the time. Even I won't try to defend some of the more egregious examples like Lost Impact or the Doom, where the levels are non-linear and wide open both vertically and horizontally, with enemies that could be in any corner of the stage with no hint at where they might be. But these are really the only stages I feel this way about. Most of the other missions have some sort of goal like find or destroy a certain amount of a certain object or take out a moving target before it leaves the stage. In the retrieval missions, you're likely to find what you need without needing to explore as long as you stick to the path your companion tells you to stick to. And if you're about to miss an objective for whatever reason, they will warn you. But the vehicle destruction missions are some of my favorite because you have to find the right balance between speed and offense. You have to make sure to keep up with the vehicle while also continuing your assault with whatever weapons you can find. But you need to break boxes and defeat enemies to get weapons, and every second you spend doing that is a second you're spending not assaulting the vehicle, and these things can take quite a lot of gunfire. There are a few other missions that stand out from the others, like the hero mission in Circus Park that requires you to get 400 rings, or Mad Matrix where you have to extract data from 3 different terminals that act like mini stages within the stage, and that's something I think is really cool. Not to mention, the different missions make for an interesting way to score attack the game. Shadow the Hedgehog retains the same ranking system from Sonic Adventure 2, and the way it works here is that you have 3 different scores for this game's alignments and missions, but even levels that don't have a mission of that particular alignment will still have a score for it. Not only are you rewarded with a higher rank for fighting your mission's opponents, but you're also punished for betraying them. So going through and killing every single enemy in your path isn't the way to go about it if you're not doing the normal mission. And it actually makes for some fun challenges and levels that are very one-sided like Gun Fortress and Final Haunt. For the respective hero and dark missions, you can't really engage with the enemies even though they're all over the place. Not unless you want to get slapped with an E ranking. So you actually have to think about which enemies you do and don't want to attack, and how fast you do it. And Shadow the Hedgehog also has a pretty reasonable ranking system, providing you with a large bonus based on how fast you beat the stage. It's definitely better than Sonic Heroes where you get an E ranking if you died or took a single hit at all throughout the stage. Although some of the missions, especially the goal ring ones, are a bit too easy. I will say there are a lot of things that Shadow can do in this game that just aren't that useful. Because of how fast Shadow picks up speed, there is not much reason to use the spin dash except for doing long distance jumps. And there's also a slide kick that you can perform by pressing X while running really fast. Also, if you press B when you're not holding a weapon, you'll do this punching attack that only does half as much damage as a homing attack. So don't do it unless you want to break a box for a weapon. And also by holding R, you can go into this strafing mode where you'll always be facing forward, and your jumps will be different. There's no reason to do this, but at least it looks cool. Another quote-unquote useless feature this game has is the key doors. Every stage has 5 keys that you can collect, and finding all of them will give you access to secret doors. It sounds like a good idea and a good way to encourage exploration, but 5 keys? Doesn't that seem like a bit much? 2 or 3 would have been reasonable, and the keys are actually hidden pretty well. Without a guide, you're probably not going to find them all on your own, and when you do follow a guide, you're going to be like, wait, how was I supposed to know it was there? And most of the time, these rewards aren't even worth it. But there are some that are, like the air saucer and lava shelter that lets you hover over all of the stage's death planes. You also have chaos powers, which are super abilities that you can use after accumulating enough points toward either your hero or dark score. Killing hero-aligned enemies like gun soldiers and destroying the environment will let you use Chaos Blast, which destroys everything nearby, while killing dark-aligned enemies like the Black Aliens lets you use Chaos Control, which sends you flying through the stage for a few seconds. A lot of people say that these powers are either useless or counterproductive, especially Chaos Control, because most hero missions have alternate objectives, and using Chaos Control can send you flying past one of those objectives. I don't disagree, but they're far from useless because, well, for one thing, Chaos Control is still extremely useful for normal missions, not to mention it has a completely different effect during boss battles, but also when either of these gauges fill up, you don't actually have to use these abilities. Until the gauge runs out, you're both invincible and have unlimited ammo, so to say that they're completely useless would be ridiculous. And that brings me to my next point of contention about this game. The guns. This comes under fire a lot. Everyone says it's cringe, it's stupid, and it's not Sonic. Well, believe it or not, guns were something fans were asking for in letters to Takashi Iizuka. In fact, they actually wanted Sonic to have one, but he didn't think it would be fitting, so he gave one to Shadow instead. Going back to that 2000s edge that this game was going for, more and more 3D platformers were including guns in their gameplay, and they were all doing very well. The Ratchet & Clank series had a focus on guns, Blinks the Time Sweeper was brandishing his vacuum weapons like guns in his games, and while not a platformer, Star Fox's latest game introduced boots-on-the-ground combat with guns. Even Mario got a projectile weapon with the Flood in Mario Sunshine. And I can't forget to mention Jak 2, which was not only much darker and edgier than its predecessor, and not only did it also add guns, but it was also the game that Iizuka played while recovering after working crunch on Sonic Heroes, and it had a lot of influence on the development of Shadow the Hedgehog. And really, when you think about it, guns have always been a part of the Sonic universe. It was true with the classic games, and it was true with the modern games that preceded this one. I suppose you could say it's a little jarring that there's such a heavy emphasis on realistic weapons, but there are still plenty of cartoony sci-fi weapons. And in fact, I think this helps the weapons of the different factions stand out from one another. You have the realistic bullet weapons used by the humans, the sci-fi Halo-like laser weapons used by the Black Arms, and then the toy-looking guns used by the Eggpawns. And I think guns are a welcome feature in this game. Shadow the Hedgehog uses an automatic aim assist system like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, where Shadow will automatically target the closest in-range enemy to the center of where he's facing. Some weapons have more lock-on range than others, but in most cases, it won't make much of a difference. Some weapons are automatic, some shoot homing bullets, some are more powerful, some don't have auto aim assist and require you to aim manually, some work like vacuums that suck everything in. There's a lot of variety with the weapons in this game, and it makes for a lot of variety with the gunplay too. There's nothing more fun than experimenting with all the different weapons this game has to offer and finding your favorite for each stage, even if the combat boils down to little more than just getting close and shooting the enemies in the face. There's no reloading either, but picking up a weapon of the same type will give you more ammo, and in levels full of enemies of the same type that carry the same weapon, it is very easy to stock up on hundreds of rounds for the same gun. A lot of people also argue that guns are useless because most enemies can be taken down with 1 or 2 homing attacks, which is true, at least early on, but the further you get, the tougher the enemies get. Taking down enemies with guns is just faster and easier either way, but they're almost necessary for the stronger enemies unless you want to spend a minute trying to kill a single one with the homing attack, which is never fun, especially in a game like Sonic where you're encouraged to go fast. I think my only real complaint about the guns is how easy they make the game. While some weapons are better than others, there aren't very many that I would say are downright bad. Even the basic pistol can take down all but the absolute toughest enemies with a single full magazine. If you ask me, what they should have done was have certain weapons be more and less effective against different enemy types, but the closest this game has to that are the enemies with shields that you need to homing attack to knock off, and the black oaks that block bullets. I guess you're supposed to melee them, but melee weapons suck so much in this game it's better to just run past them. And now that I think about it, they probably didn't do this since you can only carry one weapon at a time. Another feature this game adds that many people complain about is drivable vehicles, and people complain about this mainly because Shadow just moves faster on his feet than when in vehicles, which is true, but if you get hit while running you also come to a dead stop, whereas in vehicles they have a health bar and you can just run most enemies over. They can also be used to cross damaging floors and even death planes in certain levels. I think sections designed around the air saucer are perfect examples of vehicle implementation done right, and then you also have turrets which send you into a first-person perspective and are used to shoot at enemies or objects that may be out of reach. And I think these sections are fun too, and that's also to say nothing of the enemies that you can ride that send you into these flying shooting gallery-like sections, which I think are a lot of fun. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention the 2 Gunwalker vehicles. One of them is able to jump really high and is great for vertical platforming, while the other is slower but it has a built-in machine gun, and that's pretty cool. If you ask me, vehicles could have been implemented better, but they're far from a useless feature. I would also go so far as to say that Shadow improves upon many of the features it brings back from previous games, like grinding. It's the best it's ever been up until this point because you now have a dedicated rail switch button. They also changed how losing rings works when you take a hit. Instead of losing all your rings, you only lose 10, basically giving you an extra hit point with every 10 rings. This would have been a lot better in Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, with rings being the currency for the Chow Gardens, but I'll still take it, even if I do also think it makes the game a little too easy. And the other complaints I hear about this game in regards to the camera and the homing attack almost make me question if we're even playing the same game. I've almost never had an issue with the camera because it works the way I want it to most of the time, and when it doesn't, I can still readjust my view with the C-stick easily, and the homing attack, Sure, there have been a few times it hasn't worked when I felt like it should have, but across the hundreds of hours I've poured into all of these adventure-era Sonic games, this has been much rarer for me in Shadow the Hedgehog, and even more rarely has it sent me plummeting to my death. Even then, I would argue this is less of a problem in Shadow the Hedgehog, because if you have bad luck with the homing attack, you can just use guns to take out the enemies instead. And if for whatever reason you find yourself in a situation where you need to take down a strong enemy without one, I find just jumping into them to be more effective. I will say, compared to the other adventure games, bosses in Shadow the Hedgehog are kinda weak. There are a few that are fun and engaging, like Black Doom, the Heavy Dog and Blue Falcon, and Lethal Highway's Black Bull, but the rest of them are just too easy because there's always some kind of trick you can exploit to cheese them. Like Diablon. Once he falls to the ground, all you have to do is stand close to him, which will trigger his slap attack, then jump out of the way and attack him. The Egg Breaker in Mad Matrix has a higher up area where he can't touch you, and you can just camp up there until you either have enough ammo or a full hero meter. Prison Island's Black Bull is locked in place and you can just unload into him from the ground, and the Iron Jungle Egg Breaker, do I even need to say anything?
Oh, you asked for it. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Time to crush you. Next time we meet, you won't be so lucky. Just you wait and see.
Even the better designed bosses are pretty much done once you have a full meter, as long as you're holding a weapon because of the unlimited ammo. But overall though, I would say the gameplay in Shadow is very good, and it's a lot of fun. But I also think Shadow the Hedgehog has some good visuals, which seems to be another point of criticism. People bash this game for its graphics because the textures are apparently bland and dark and dreary as opposed to being bright and colorful like a Sonic game should be. Okay, first of all, the name of the character you play as in the title of this game is literally Shadow. I don't know what you would have wanted. But this isn't even true. Not only do plenty of stages have bright and colorful texture palettes, but they also have a lot of detail to them and a lot going on in the backgrounds. Take Circus Park, for example. It's a demented theme park built by Eggman, which not only has a very vibrant texture palette, but it's also decorated with flashing objects. Eggman has his face plastered everywhere as he likes to, there are hot air balloons floating in the background, and there are even fireworks going off. It's a similar deal for Cryptic Castle, but with more of a Halloween theme with pumpkins and sparks from torches going off all around you. Then there's Mad Matrix and Digital Circuit, lots of flashing colors and moving lights in the background. There's also this circuit board-like background as if you're in the inside of a computer, which is very appropriate for stages set in cyberspace. As much as I dislike these stages, Lost Impact and the Doom are a great interpretation of what the inside of the Ark's lab looks like. The hallways are lined up with consoles and screens that contain scientific data, sometimes maps. Then you have the outside shooting sections in Lost Impact with the asteroids and the flashing objects. The same is true for the other Ark stages. Cosmic Fall is another good one, with it being set on the Ark as it's literally collapsing and you have to awkwardly navigate across the platforms as they come down around you. There's Gun Fortress and Air Fleet, which have this industrial theme to them, Gun Fortress being underground while Air Fleet is high up. I mean, you've got the gun logo plastered all over the place, there are these roadways and garages that have parked vehicles all over them, some of the rooms have landing pads for aerial vehicles, there are signal lights all over the place. Air Fleet also has a really beautiful background where when you look out the window you can see other parts of the ship and other ships flying around in the background. I'm not sure what the deal is with the Electric Sea and Gun Fortress, but at least it looks cool. Sky Troops has this really cool Heavenly Temple aesthetic to it. You can see the black alien fluid under the ruins, which is presumably how the temple is able to fly. There are other pieces of the temple in the distance. Some of them are shooting lasers at Eggman's battleships, which can also be seen in the distance because it's a shootout in the sky. Then you have the inside of the temples with the otherworldly decorations and the glowing orbs keeping the temple afloat. Then you have that part where you go inside the clouds with the rain and everything. It's all just so cool. And my two personal favorite stages aesthetic-wise, Black Comet and Final Haunt, which are set on the Black Alien's home. They have this living beehive from hell feel to them. So many things are moving, so many things are glowing, including the floor. You have the alien slime floating around and those vein-like things. There are these beating heart things on the walls. You have the giant tentacles moving around. The doors to the hallways open up like something from a body. The hallways have this octagonal shape going back to the whole hive thing. It all really makes the Black Comet feel alive. But what really fascinates me the most are those buildings that we see in the background. At least that's what I think they are. They even have parts that are lit up like windows. So, are the alien civilians watching me kill their friends and family from those windows? I'm probably overthinking these things, but these are some really beautifully designed stages. And yeah, I guess there is a lot of black and purple, but again, Black Comet, Black Arms, Black Doom, I don't know what you were expecting. Even the city stages like Westopolis and Central City, which are criticized a lot for their designs, look good. I mean, they're war zones that are being attacked by aliens. There are lasers being blasted from the sky. The buildings are all very detailed. There are burning cars parked along the road. You can even see the buildings collapsing in front of you. And it's not like Sonic has always been nothing but bright and colorful. Even in the classic games, stages like Chemical Plant Zone, Chrome Gadget, Mystic Cave Zone, and so many others all feature darker and drearier texture palettes, not unlike what is seen in Shadow the Hedgehog. I simply just don't understand why people say Shadow the Hedgehog is a bad looking game. Probably my only complaint in regards to the visuals is the character models, which are ripped straight from Sonic Heroes and they do not fit in with the rest of the game at all. And this includes Shadow, who isn't even the right color. Shadow is supposed to be black, but here he's more of a dark brown. I don't get it. At least everyone unanimously accepts that the music is good, but that's pretty much a given for any Sonic game. Also, something that isn't really discussed much now, but was kind of a big deal when this game came out, they brought over the voice cast from Sonic X, which I guess Sega did to unify the two. In fact, my copy of Sonic Riders came with a free Sonic X DVD, and the voice acting here isn't bad. It's definitely better than Adventure 1 and Heroes, but it does strike me as a little odd that the game that's supposed to be darker and edgier would be the first game to use the voice cast selected by 4Kids, a company infamous for censoring and Americanizing their shows, and also this.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
But now I want to get into this game's second biggest point of contention, the story, and also the branching story structure. Which stage the game sends you to depends on which mission you complete. Shadow the Hedgehog's story is about Shadow trying to figure out just who he really is, and the path you take not only decides who gains the upper hand in the end, but it also reveals different things about Shadow's past. Siding with Black Doom has him constantly reminding Shadow of how Gun invaded the space colony Ark, killing everyone on it, including his best friend, and he uses this to manipulate Shadow into fighting for him to take revenge against the human race for doing it, while the hero route has Sonic reminding Shadow of how he sacrificed himself to save the world at the end of Adventure 2. It gives you quite a bit of freedom with how you go about playing these stages and getting this game's different endings. At any point, you can choose to either betray or stop supporting whichever side you've been helping. If you want, you can choose to be a bad guy with a merciful side, you can be a good guy with a somewhat skewed sense of morality, you can go completely neutral and just go after the guy that supposedly knows the truth about your past, or you can be a complete anti-hero and do whatever you want. In fact, every time you take a new path, you unlock a new title in the library, which is just all the cutscenes of whichever path you took, and there is a total of 326 of these. So in order to truly 100% the game with a full library, you have to play the game at least 326 times, and that's not something even I'm willing to do, nor would I suggest anyone do it, not even the most diehard fan of this game. Now, this is a great idea on paper, but it's flawed in execution. Cutscenes will play before and after levels, but the game makes almost no effort to tie them together for the paths that most people will be taking. For example, if you go completely neutral doing all normal missions, you'll wind up in Sky Troops, which opens up with a cutscene of Shadow standing next to Black Doom and his flying temple. The thing is though, Sky Troops is the same temple that Glyphic Canyon is set in, and the dark mission for that is to touch the jewels to make the temple fly. So if you do the normal mission for that and the next stage, not only did you not make the temple fly, but you also blew off Black Doom 3 times in a row, yet he still gives you a free ride with first class seats on his floating temple battleship thing. Then, when you get to Iron Jungle, the hero mission there is to destroy Eggman's transportation balloon so that you can confront him. But you don't actually confront him. I mean, you fight him as a boss, but you do that no matter which mission you take. And don't even get me started on how Eggman is basically just a placeholder final boss for a third of this game's endings. I do think 10 different endings that all needed to be completed to unlock the true ending was pretty excessive. But even though you do have to get all 10 of this game's endings, you can get to them in any way you want. Outside of Westopolis, you'll rarely have to play any mission more than once, and even when you do, it's a perfect opportunity to take another shot at getting an A rank if you didn't get it the first time. And I will say, in regards to the story, if you know which missions to do in an order that makes sense, you just might actually be in for something resembling a coherent and well put together storyline, and I'll tell you a few of my favorites. Do all Dark mission up until Cryptic Castle, then do the neutral mission there, and do Dark for the rest of the game. This has Shadow fully support Black Doom. He doesn't help Eggman in Cryptic Castle because even though that's the Dark mission, the whole point of that is to keep the black creatures out. Then Black Doom shows Shadow a flashback of Gun going after him and killing Maria, motivating him even more. He helps Black Doom take over the Ark, and then invades Gun Fortress, putting an end to the human resistance. Another one is doing the neutral mission for Westopolis, pissing off Black Doom, causing Shadow to reconsider his decision to ignore him, doing the Dark mission for Glyphic Canyon, but then when he gets to Cryptic Castle, he helps out Cream and Cheese, then joins Black Doom again in the fight against Eggman, but ultimately chooses to betray Black Doom and help Eggman, thinking he might know something. But Eggman escapes him, after which he's picked up by Sonic and taken to the Ark. But he loses the race against Sonic, leaving the Ark vulnerable to be attacked by the Black Arms, causing it to collapse, followed by Shadow being confronted by Gun Commander, who tells him of his not-so-heroic past. Then, to atone, Shadow helps Vector find the computer room, and then disappears after fighting off Black Doom. For the story about Shadow confronting Eggman, do all normal missions up until Prison Island, where Shadow helps Charmy find the discs that lead to Eggman's network. But once there, Shadow assists Black Doom in taking down the network, and after hearing Eggman say that he has no past, Shadow goes to Iron Jungle, where he questions his identity even further after seeing Eggman's army of Shadow androids. So, Shadow follows him into the lava shelter where he activates Eggman's volcanic defenses so that nobody besides him and Omega can confront Eggman. And then, for a hero-leaning story, Shadow does all hero mission until he gets to Death Ruins, where he chooses to stop helping after getting shot at by the gun soldiers despite him helping them. Then in Space Gadget, he shows his superiority to Sonic by beating him to the Emerald, taking him to the Black Comet, where he betrays Sonic just to fight him and show him up. These are a few serious ones, but I also have a few funny meme-worthy ones, like Shadow does all Dark mission except for Digital Circuit and Gun Fortress just because he decides to simp for Rouge, and then there's one where Shadow starts by doing both the Dark missions, but when he meets Amy, he's reminded of his conversation with her on the Ark, and decides to completely turn around and do nothing but hero mission for the rest of the game. That's not even my headcanon, by the way. The library sequence for that is officially called The Miracle of Love. I'd love to hear your guys' favorite sequences if you have any. A lot of people also attack this game for how it supposedly ruined Shadow's character. Here, he's just edgy the hedgy, but neither of those things are entirely correct. The thing is, Shadow isn't really any sort of established character in this game. The whole story is him trying to figure out just who and what he is, and what he learns and how he goes about that is determined by the player. Since Shadow's introduction, there's been the whole debate of whether or not Shadow is an anti-hero, but the point of this game isn't to brand Shadow as an anti-hero. He can be an anti-hero if that's what you, the player, decides, but he can also be edgy the hedgy, or a black-hearted evil, along with a brave-hearted hero. That's the point of the game. That's what the opening theme, I Am All of Me, is telling you. The opening to this game isn't showing you Shadow going around beating up and shooting everyone in sight to make him look cool. I mean, that's kind of what it's doing, but what the opening is really showing you is that these are all the things that Shadow can do, all the things he can be. This is where some people will argue that Shadow would never do any of the evil things he does in the opening or the dark paths. But remember, after he quote-unquote died at the end of Adventure 2 and returned in Heroes, Shadow lost most of his memories from the events of that game. In fact, in Heroes, they don't even really tell you whether or not the Shadow in that game is the same one from Adventure 2 or a clone, and that's the same one you play as in Shadow the Hedgehog. Even in Adventure 2, it's never made all that clear if that Shadow is even the original Ultimate Life form. Even then, we still don't know much about his past, and considering that his memories were altered in Adventure 2, even if he does retain any of them, he has every reason to question what he still remembers. I would also argue that even in Adventure 2, Shadow's morality was questionable. Yes, it was Shadow who sacrificed himself to save the Earth at the end of Adventure 2, but that was only after secretly working with Eggman to help fulfill Professor Gerald's request to use the Ark to destroy the world out of revenge for killing Maria, which he thought was her dying wish. He only realizes the truth after a short conversation with Amy, and even then, even though he's working for a good cause, the only reason he does it is because Maria told him to? it's a little questionable why Shadow would want to take revenge on the entire human race to begin with. Even if it was his best friend's dying wish, he's okay with that? I think the fact that Shadow would be so willing to do something like that for any reason to begin with would prevent him from being labeled as a hero. At least that's what I was thinking at first, but then I remember that Shadow spent all of his time before being sent into stasis on board the Ark. He's never been to Earth, and he doesn't know much about the human race or what life is like on Earth. And Maria and Gerald are his only friends. They're his family. So when a bunch of strangers just show up out of nowhere and start randomly killing everyone, including his only family, when they haven't done anything wrong, that's his first look at what the human race is like. From what he's seen, he can assert that humans are an evil race, so he probably has no moral objection to exterminating the human race, because the first humans he met, and only humans he would know besides Maria and Gerald for a long time, killed his family and tried to kill him. That skewed sense of morality is why it's not hard to see Shadow carrying out Gerald's wish for revenge and siding with Black Doom, especially when Black Doom uses those memories to manipulate Shadow into working for him. Another thing to note is that every route in this game has Shadow getting back bits and pieces of his memories, but only the ones that motivate him to support the path that he's taking. In the Dark Path, Black Doom tells Shadow about how he and Maria were hunted down and murdered by gun soldiers to fuel his hatred for the human race. But he conveniently leaves out the part about Maria asking him to protect the human race so that they can be happy. In the Pure Hero Path, he's reminded about how he and Sonic worked together to save the Earth from the collapsing Ark, but he's never told about the fact that he was working to take revenge on the human race for the majority of the game, nor is he ever told why Gun Commander hates him so much. If you deviate from the hero path a little bit and get to Cosmic Fall, Shadow learns that Professor Gerald made a deal with Black Doom to create him in exchange for Shadow helping him in his war against the human race later. He made a figurative deal with the devil, which not only reveals a disturbing truth about Shadow's origins, but also provides a bit of justification for Gun's raid on the Ark. In the pure neutral paths, as far as Shadow is aware, he's not the real Shadow, so even if he remembers saving the world or how the humans killed Maria, it didn't happen to him, so he doesn't care. Shadow is very strong and very powerful, but he's also very much a loose cannon. His lack of a moral compass and willingness to do whatever it takes to learn about his past makes him very gullible and very dangerous. His vulnerability to manipulation is his biggest weakness, and that's a big part of this game that I think flies over a lot of people's heads. Now that I think about it, it's actually kind of funny that in paths where Shadow is either going neutral or betrays the side he's been helping at the end, he says that nobody tells him what to do, when in Sonic Adventure 2 and most paths in this game, and even arguably in Heroes, everything he did there, he did because someone told him to do it. I'm not going to pretend that the story for this game is some kind of underappreciated masterpiece. It's cheesy, it's silly, and the plot has more holes than Charlie Brown's ghost costume. And if you have to meticulously follow some kind of weird story route and create your own headcanons for the paths to make sense, something is seriously wrong. But I do still think Shadow the Hedgehog is a good dive into Shadow's origins, tying some of the loose ends left with his previous two games, along with a very powerful message about moving on and not letting your past define who you are at the end. But the worst thing about it, that even I won't try to defend, is that none of these endings even matter because of how they went about the true ending. I already talked about how you have to get all 10 endings to even unlock it, but it just makes all the other endings feel pointless. I mean, we don't know what happened that led up to this. We don't know which ending it follows, if any of them. The game just expects you to shut up and not think about it. I mean, I like to think that Shadow did some kind of journey where he was able to develop as a character and develop his own sense of morality. Maybe he did a bit of work for both Gun and Black Doom and maybe Eggman. Maybe he learned a few things about his past on his own. We don't know. Nobody does. We still don't even know if this is the real Shadow or an android. Oh, no, wait, we actually do. It's confirmed that this game's Shadow and the one in Heroes is the original Shadow through dialogue from Eggman that plays during the final boss if it goes on long enough. Okay, first of all, this is one of the easiest final bosses in the entire franchise, and it shouldn't take the average player more than a couple of minutes. But if you are somehow garbage enough at the game that you let the fight drag on for long enough to hear this dialogue, you're probably going to be too distracted by the boss to even notice, and it's never even made clear if Shadow actually heard that dialogue himself. But I do still think the true ending is very powerful. At the end of the game, Shadow learns the truth, but when he does, he realizes that his past isn't what's important, and he's not going to let it define him. He may be Black Doom's biological son, his purpose may have been to be used as a tool to take over the Earth by Black Doom, but that's not what's important anymore. What's important is what he's going to do right now, in this moment and in the future. He's not going to let some ghostly alien or some friend that's been dead for 50 years define who he is. He's going to leave his past behind him and stop Black Doom, because he knows that this is what's morally right. And I would say this is what completes Shadow's transformation from anti-hero or whatever to hero. And that makes Shadow the Hedgehog a very important game for Shadow's character. But this game's poor reputation has unfortunately damaged his character. This game is Shadow's origin story. Shadow is literally Black Doom's biological son. But according to the vocal fanbase, a darker themed game with an origin story like that is stupid and doesn't belong in the series. But there's too much in this game to retcon, and it's inseparable from Shadow's character. Because Sega has been so embarrassed by this game, they haven't been giving Shadow any major roles, because featuring Shadow would be featuring the same guy whose game ruined the series with guns and aliens and try-hard edginess. And I don't think that's fair. This game isn't even all that edgy after the opening, but it feels like everyone is so repulsed by the in-your-face edginess of the opening and how it supposedly goes against everything the series is supposed to be, they've already decided that the game sucks before they've even started playing. And when they actually do start playing, they overblow its flaws while ignoring the things it does well. It makes a lot of the criticisms of this game feel disingenuous. This game gets more harshly bashed for things that are done worse in other Sonic games, and things that it does well on its own, like the guns, aren't criticized because they're flawed, but because they're in the game to begin with, which is why we'll probably never get another game that plays like this. This is because, unlike most publishers that really only care about sales, Sega is actually one of the few that cares about both critical and fan reception, which, as we've seen, not just with Shadow the Hedgehog, but with other games like Adventure, Adventure 2, Heroes, and especially 06, this isn't always a good thing, because it makes Sega think that they need to retire any ideas that the fans respond poorly to. And the worst part is that a lot of these things, like the missions and branching story, could have been improved upon with a sequel. But again, the supposed issue isn't that they're flawed, it's that they exist. It's the reason it took almost 2 decades for Shadow to get another game of his own, and honestly, I think this has more to do with Paramount including him in the ending sequence of the second movie. It's also why, unless Silver appears in the ending scene of Sonic 3, which will probably already be out by the time this video is up, I'm just recording this before, but even if it's true, I don't want to spoil it, we probably won't get another game with him either. I mean, at least Shadow can say he came from one of the best Sonic games. Silver came from 06, which is more of a paragon of failure than a game. Now, I've been trying to avoid bringing my nostalgia into this video, but this is the part where my nostalgia bias is really going to show, because this is a big part of why Shadow is so special to me. As a sheltered kid raised by fundagelical crackpot parents who ate up all the anti-video game sensationalism from the media at the time, I was extremely limited on how much time I could play video games, and I was only allowed to play E-rated games. I mean, my dad didn't even let me get Super Smash Bros. Brawl for my 12th birthday because it was rated T and I was only 12. This isn't to say I wasn't satisfied with the games I played growing up as a kid, but because these games had to be appropriate for all audiences, they were limited on what kind of things you could do in them. Shadow the Hedgehog was the first game I ever played with a choice-based morality system. It was the first game I played where you could attack the good guys and side with the bad guys. It was the first game I owned where you could pick up and shoot realistic firearms. It was the first game I owned where the character swore, which I just thought was so hardcore at the time. And because of its E10 rating, I was allowed to play it. Granted, I was under 10 at the time I played it, but I guess nobody in my dyslexic family saw the 10 symbol awkwardly stitched at the bottom of the E, which stood out a lot less than a big fat T or M would have. I was also already a really big Sonic fan when this game came out. In fact, I was more than just a fan. I didn't make OCs or anything, but I was one of those weird kids that would be watching Sonic fan videos on YouTube and writing my own fan fictions when I should have been paying attention in class, and I would reenact them in the games when I got home. And my fan fictions were considerably edgier than what was in the games. Shadow the Hedgehog was everything I could have asked for in a Sonic game, bringing all these things to Sonic, a series I was already familiar with a gameplay style I was and still am in love with. It was like a dream come true. It's the only Sonic game like this. I mean, there aren't really any other games like this at all. And that's one of the reasons this game has stuck with me over the years. It's the same reason I also have a bit of a soft spot for 06. Not only does it feature some pretty awesome vehicle sections with Shadow, but it's also the only 3D Sonic game where Silver is playable with his psychokinetic powers that allow you to pick up objects and sling them into enemies. And that's fun! It's flawed because it's in 06, which is an incredibly rushed and unpolished game, but it's the only game that has and probably ever will have this. And while this game does have a lot of nostalgia for me, there have been plenty of other games, movies, TV shows, and other things that I grew up with and realized they weren't actually that good when I went back to them. However, there are also many things I loved as a kid that, after going back to them when I was older, I thought they were bad and stupid and ridiculous, but after going back to them again when I was even older, I learned to appreciate them for things I wasn't even aware of before, and now I like them even more than I did when I was a kid. And Shadow the Hedgehog is one of them because of how it reminds me of what things were like back in the mid-2000s. Yeah, it's easy to make fun of how this game about a 3-foot-tall anthropomorphic hedgehog who uses realistic firearms to fight aliens is completely serious and unironic about everything it's doing, and wants to be taken seriously with a straight face. It wants to be cool, but to most people it's cringe, but to me it circles back around to being cool again. It was very much a product of its time, and we just don't get these types of games anymore. Today, it feels like developers are just playing it safe by giving fans exactly what they want. Shadow the Hedgehog reminds us of a time when they weren't afraid to take risks and try out even the most ridiculous of ideas. I did say in the beginning that a more mature-themed game was something many Sonic fans wanted, but there were many Sonic fans that were against it too, and I'm sure Sega knew that there were going to be many people that hated this game for this reason, but they went ahead with it anyway. Though I don't think even they could have really seen just how detested this game would become. And because of that, it's unlikely that we'll ever get another game like it again. I can only hope that after more people see the movie, people will be more willing to play Shadow the Hedgehog with an open mind, and not just die of cringe after watching the opening. One thing that I think would help with that would be a Steam release, to make it more accessible to new players, and while they're at it, they should give Unleashed a port, and Heroes. In fact, Heroes already has a native PC port, so I don't know why it's not on Steam. Now, if you dislike this game mainly because of the alternate missions and multiple endings and just want a linear experience that you can get done in one go, then I recommend you check out Expert Mode. It's a gauntlet of every stage in the game with some small modifications that make the stages harder, but every stage has only one goal, and with 2 exceptions, that goal is to get to the goal ring at the end. It does kind of suck that there are no bosses and you're not scored, and the game doesn't keep any records of your time or anything, but if you want to enjoy this game as a traditional 3D linear Sonic game, this is the best way to experience this game. Now, I don't blame you if you haven't unlocked it, nor do I blame you if you didn't even know about it, because in order to unlock it, you have to get an A rank in every mission, which not many people have the patience to do. However, today, with the ease of emulation, you can just download a save file off the internet and play it that way. And if you're a purist, well, it may be worth asking a friend if they have a completed save file on a memory card that you can copy. Now, if you like the concepts that this game introduces, but you dislike the way they're implemented and designed, then I recommend you check out Shadow the Hedgehog Reloaded. It's a great fan-made mod made by Dream Syntax that makes the game less repetitive and addresses most of the bigger issues people have with the gameplay. Just to name a few changes, you can now get the true ending after only having gotten 3 endings. Expert mode is now unlocked after completing the last story. Missions are more forgiving with their objectives. Key doors have been removed with the keys being replaced with red rings. Platforms move up and down faster. Melee weapons are a lot better. It even makes some improvements that I didn't think were needed but are still welcome. Like the S rank has now been added. You can now play through the single player mode as the Shadow androids from 2-player mode. Triangle jump has been improved. There's a new melee style you can switch to. You can slide indefinitely. Air saucers have a new attack. You can now move faster on light rails. You can move faster in vehicles by tapping A. Levels have been slightly modified and have new areas, and some unused content has been restored. There are even some small improvements to the visuals, like textures have been modified in certain levels to make stages look less like others. It really is everything the original game should have been, and I cannot recommend it enough. But even Reloaded wouldn't exist without the base game. Shadow the Hedgehog is by no means a perfect game, but I do still think it's a good game, and even with all its flaws, for many of the reasons I just mentioned, it will always be near and dear to me. You guys have all responded very well to my Sonic content, but I don't really know if it's something I'll start doing regularly on this channel. I'm not actually hardcore into Sonic anymore. Really, the only games in this series I'm passionate about are these 2000s era Sonic games, especially Shadow the Hedgehog, and really, I've just been taking the release of the third movie as an excuse to make Shadow-related content, because, as I said, for a long time this was my favorite Sonic game, and Shadow is my favorite character in the series. It's probably going to be something I do every now and then, but just don't expect to see it regularly. But whatever the case, guys, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Be sure to check out my other videos in the description. Be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe, and until the next video, I will see you all later.